Good afternoon, Mrs. Smith. My name is Sunny Kaplash. I'm a medical student, and I'm coming in to talk to you because I understand you have some concerns about your child's proposed surgery. Now, I understand that they'll likely be having a hernia repair, and your concern is the risk of anesthetics on your child. And so, uh, what I've done to help sort of address this issue is I've done a literature review, and I found an article that I think might be helpful in tackling this issue. Um, I do want to, begin by explaining that when we're discussing a hernia repair, um, what we're talking about is a hernia. In this case is when we have sort of a section of bowel being the small or large intestine, that sort of moves out of its original cavity or original resting place and sort of finds itself in some place new. And that's what's called a hernia. It'll often go through the abdomen, into the pelvis, into the testicles, or into the groin in general. And the risks of that, of that sort of structural development are that if that bowel sort of gets twisted in a special way or cut off from its blood supply, which is more common when it's not in its original place, it can lose blood supply, and unfortunately that tissue can sort of die off, which would lead to a whole host of complications, and probably more complicated surgeries. That's sort of why we favor correcting these before they get to that point. Now, with regards to your original concern, those being to anesthesia, there was an article that I found in JAMA Pediatrics, which is a pretty high impact journal, and they published a study that examined the association or the relationship between anesthesia and surgery before the age of 4 years old, and intelligence outcomes. And so this was done in Sweden over the course of approximately 20 years, 1973 to 1993. And that's when all the patients underwent surgery, and all the data was collected, but the data wasn't really analyzed until 2013. And in total, they had about 2 million total patients that they looked at, and they ended up having about 33,000 from those that they could actually analyze. And so what they had found essentially was that in all those kids, many of whom had at least one surgery, which means they had at least one exposure to anesthesia, they found mean difference or an average change in the IQ of 0.41%, 0.41%. And they found that this difference in the IQ didn't really, it wasn't really affected by multiple exposures to surgery or multiple exposures to anesthesia is what I mean there. And they actually found that of all the things that can impact a child's outcome IQ, the risk of anesthesia was actually less than, or the effect of anesthesia was less when compared to other factors, such as maternal education level, what month the child was born in, and the sex of the child. So compared to those three variables, anesthesia did not have as strong of an effect as those did. And when anesthesia does have an effect, like I said earlier, it was about 0.41%. Now, this article definitely does say that there is an effect, but I do believe that there are some very important caveats to this study that I think we need to take into account here. So, for one, it was performed in Sweden, which is a different genetic population, or just different ethnically and culturally from the United States. So there might be, something implicit there that might be impacting the results. The surgeries were done between 1973 and 1993, and we are now a couple decades removed from that time, and it's hard to know how much of that IQ change was inherent to our surgical practices back then. We now favor more minimally invasive, shorter surgeries with likely less exposure to any anesthesia at all, or relatively less anesthesia exposure compared to those surgeries before. Not to mention, this wasn't a blinded, randomized study. This was what's called a retrospective review, in which we looked back at charts, and that can also have sort of what's called an implicit bias, or a bias in analysis from the people conducting the study, whether they knew they were doing that or not. So that's also important to keep in mind. And sort of, lastly, 0.41% IQ change is incredibly small, and it's hard to know what that would look like in real life. If you had two kids and their IQ changed only by 0.41%, it would, by my estimation, be a pretty tough difference to spot in any type of academic performance. This study also only looked at one measure of intelligence, which is IQ, and that's certainly not indicative of a child's entire sort of cognitive capacity. So I think these are all important things to keep in mind, and I would love to, further just discuss with you your interpretation of all of this. My total interpretation, looking at all these facts and looking at all sort of the ancillary details to consider, I would venture to say that, in fact, it's unlikely that anesthesia poses a strong, morbid risk on children. And it's also, I would also say this study is imperfect in a lot of ways, in terms of the way they measured intelligence, the population they did it in, and when the surgeries happened. So as of right now, there's no strong data to suggest that there is any real effect of anesthesia or undergoing a hernia surgery and its long-term effects. So I hope that was informative. And what questions do you have?